All right. Hello, everyone. I'm back with Dr. Beau Branson. This is our second conversation. You can check out our first conversation. I'll leave a link to that in the description. That might be helpful. If you're finding this video first, I would recommend you listen to that instead. But we're going to be continuing the conversation that we had and delving into some topics related to the Trinity, Eastern Orthodox understandings of it, and biblical Unitarian understandings of God and Jesus. And just the goal of this is a conversation to learn from each other, to delve into these topics politely and respectfully, but still with serious depth and engagement too, because the Trinity has been a topic that can often cause heated and unproductive discussions, but our goal is to have the opposite of that. And
Yeah.
I really enjoyed our first
Very
conversation, and I got a lot of really good feedback from it. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you again.
Well, I enjoyed our first conversation too, so I'm happy that. And I checked out the one. I realize now you've got a whole channel with all these talks now, but I checked out the second one that you sent me a link to. This is a little bit. So
Yeah, I think I'm up to 5 or 6 now. This might be 6 or 7. I can't remember. And I also, so there will be sometime coming out soon, there will be a debate that I had that was with Chris Date, who's
really,
yes, who debated Dale Tuggy.
yeah,
I
yeah.
got invited by Preston Sprinkle, who hosts the Theology and the Raw podcast, to have a discussion with him. It was bordering. It was somewhere in the borderlands between a debate and a discussion. It stayed very polite. I was very happy with the tenor of the conversation, but it was a little bit more like we had opening statements and rebuttals, and it was still kind of somewhere in between.
That actually sounds really good to me.
Yes, yeah, I think it ended up being good. I'm curious to listen to
It's
it,
not up yet,
honestly.
right?
It's not up yet.
Okay.
It was recorded last week, and it's still on the editing board. It should be released probably any day now.
I'll be interested to hear that. I feel a lot of times like the very formal debates don't end up being very productive because people are just focused on like responding to things and objecting to things and getting stuff out in a certain amount of time, and they don't necessarily have enough time to get as far into detail about something as they want. So
And I asked Chris in that conversation just a couple of sort of clarifying, cross-examining questions. I would say Chris is a good example of sort of the mainstream evangelical American view on the Trinity nowadays. But it was still hard for me to understand exactly what he meant. But I feel like one thing that I've learned is that there's actually a pretty wide variety of differences in some views of the Trinity, and that yours and his are quite different. And he's very much the egalitarian sort of kind of Augustinian tradition, but with an especial emphasis on Yahweh, right? Like Augustine would have never, I don't think, knew the word Yahweh, or really that maybe even that the Jews had a special name for God. But nowadays that seems to be a particular evangelical focus. I might even say preoccupation is tying in the Trinity as Yahweh, and therefore Jesus as Yahweh, and the Holy Spirit as Yahweh, and the Father as Yahweh. And I just found that hard to wrap my head around, because it feels like there's 4 persons, and I never quite got around how there aren't 4 persons there.
Yeah.
And I think I heard you say something similar on your presentation, that the common egalitarian Trinity seems to have 4 selves.
That doesn't sound like something I would say, but the self language, I don't.
Oh, sure, that's a Dale Tuggy word.
Yeah, it's a Dale thing. But I do agree that there are ways of trying to flesh it out where people end up really, I think, having 4 persons or 4 distinct entities, and that can't be right.
Right.
however the Trinity works.
That's not on the table.
That
Yeah.
was not intended.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, that'll be interesting. I'd like to see that and see what I'll see what his take is on it.
Yeah, I'm curious to get a chance to listen to him because kind of in, the heat of that debate conversation thing, I had some questions for him when I was listening, but then we kind of moved on and I don't think I got a full chance to absorb what he said. I didn't really understand it live. And so part of me was skeptical that it was able to be understood, but maybe it's just that I need a couple more times to go over it. I just really didn't understand. He seemed to switch back and forth between being a like a human being is a single being, which to
Right.
me is pretty much synonymous with person, or is being like the ground of being, in which case like the divine substance could be
Really, in
something.
essence.
Yeah, and so it's like,
Yeah.
because if you're gonna say he about it, then it's sort of like that first use of being, like he, the Trinity, or he Yahweh. Then it's like that first definition. But if it's
Yeah.
the second one, then I don't see how you could use personal pronouns about it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's maybe at some point we'll have to talk about the pronoun things. That's I mean, I get what you're saying. There's some cases where Dale makes these arguments, and Andrew from the Contramodalism website makes these arguments sometimes about pronouns. Sometimes I think those arguments are mistaken, though. Sometimes it depends on the context, but
Interesting.
I mean, so for example, like I don't believe in the existence of, well, or at least I'm skeptical about the existence of social entities like governments or corporations or things like this that are like, is that really a thing?
Right, or like even a family. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so sometimes family is actually one where I'm kind of like, well, maybe that's a real thing, but but something like, I don't know, Apple or Microsoft or something, it's like, is there a thing called Apple Incorporated or Microsoft or Google, or is this just a convenient shorthand for talking about a whole lot of people that kind of at any given moment are employed in a certain way,
Right.
But yet, I mean, I'll talk about Apple and I'll say, so maybe with Apple, I might say they did such and such, but I'll talk about like the Senate and I'll say it did something, it voted.
Right, the Senate passed or the Senate voted,
Passed.
or even the Senate wants to pass or something like that.
Yeah, and I might say the Senate wants instead of the Senate want.
Right.
Like if it was plural, it would be want. They want to do.
Right.
Say the Senate wants to do this or that. So I mean, we have these words that are singular. This is something that Gregory of Nyssa. It's part of what he talks about in one of his Trinitarian treatises on Adablabium. He talks about the fact that there are these collective nouns that grammatically the correct form is singular, even though semantically it indicates a plurality of individuals. Yeah, I mean, so even personal pronouns. So like sometimes they point out, like talking about the Trinity. I think there's a point where Gregory Nazianzen says something about, I don't know, my beloved Trinity or something like that, and he says you, like in the singular, but like people do that. People say my country, 'tis of thee, which is singular. And like I don't know that I mean, I might say my country, 'tis of thee, but I'm like, I don't know if I think it's an entity.
But you wouldn't say the Senate himself or the United States himself, right? Itself or themselves.
Yeah. So that's another issue, is like in English, we almost always tend to make non-persons its instead of hims and hers or he's and she's. with animals, if they're male or female, sometimes some people will refer to animals as its.
Right.
It's controversial for pet owners,
Yeah.
but yeah, and I noticed this too because my wife is Russian, and so there's some differences in how they will treat the gender.
Mhm.
Even things like if you see sometimes we'd see like a dead animal on the road or something, and she'd say, "Who is it?" And I'd be like, "What do you mean? Who is like? What are you asking me? Like it's I don't know. It's like
George the deer.
Fido. Yeah, like I don't know. I mean, and but it's just that's the way in Russian you would really say like what is like what
Uh-huh.
kind of animal is it like? But they say it like who is it?
Yeah.
Which to us makes it sound like, well, you're personifying this thing or something.
You're asking for an individual identifier.
Yeah, and that's the individual that you want to know, but it's just kind of a phenomenon of the language. But that, like in Greek, though, every noun has a gender, and you have to use the pronoun that has the same gender as the noun.
Mm-hmm.
So
like Spanish or something.
Yeah, exactly. It's the exact same way. And one thing that's funny is that actually there's a lot of cases where the translation will say something like the Trinity, and then it'll say he or him. But that's not what it says in the Greek. In the Greek, it'll say she because trios is feminine. And so if you look it up, it actually always has a feminine pronoun, which like really, I mean, it's one of these things like, I mean, how literally do you translate it? Like, you could just translate it as she, the Trinity herself, and then you would just have all this like weird stuff where you're talking about the Trinity as she.
Right.
But that's, I mean, all the Greek fathers are calling the Trinity she because that's just the grammar.
Right.
So it really becomes, it's really an issue of like the translator kind of has to make an interpretation like, do I think that the Trinity should be called it? Because in other cases, like if I was talking about, I don't know, wisdom or something, like I would translate it as it in English, even though they're going to be saying she in Greek because it's a feminine noun. So I'd have to make the decision as a translator, like, do I think the Trinity is an it? So I'm going to translate she as it, or do I think the Trinity is a person? But it's weird in English to use the feminine, so I'll translate it as he. And it's just the reality is like most of the translators kind of have a theology where they're thinking, well, the Trinity is God, and so I should translate that as he, even though that's not really either way. You're kind of making an interpretation, and the Greek is always going to say, literally speaking, she, but it's in the same way that like the sun is a he and wisdom's a she and things like that.
Right. Yeah. That is interesting. There's so much of this that seems bound up in translation difficulties.
In the language, yeah, you mentioned that.
It gets frustrating.
Yeah. What was his name? Was it Luke or?
With Luke, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that. I think it came up in the talk with Luke at one point. You're like, I wonder how much of this has to do with language. And I was like, a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of it has to do with language.
Right.
I really do think so too. I mean, because I've noticed there's a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff happening about the Trinity, like in English in the early modern period. And at some point it kind of dawned on me, I was like when did English come into existence? Like, you know what I mean? Like Shakespeare, I mean, like the King James Bible was 1611, and that's like one of the kind of, I mean, it's something that sort of solidified the language, like at that point. And Shakespeare wasn't much before that. Like you go too much further back, and it's like Chaucer, and it's tantamount to a different language when you're reading Chaucer, and so really, I mean, I think a lot of what happens in English is you've got a particular group of people where like this new language is starting to form, and they're kind of like the really highly educated people are putting things from Latin into an English idiom, but it's all kind of being colored by their theology too. And so now we have a lot of idioms, like things that are idiomatic in English, and that if you violated those linguistic norms, people flip out and they think that you're some kind of crazy heretic or whatever. But it's like, well, really, this is just a norm in the English language. Like one thing, like just an example of something I mean, like whether to capitalize the word God. Like there's just kind of this, it's just a traditional thing in English. We want to just capitalize it, like no matter what. We want to always capitalize it when it's God, but then if it's like a false god or the pagan gods,
then we'll lowercase it. Yeah.
Which is really just a way to like kind of be a jerk to the pagan, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's a problem because it's like, well, if you want to say like, oh, I don't know, I mean like in the Old Testament, you know, Yahweh is God, or like the Lord is God, like, is that an identity statement between two names? Is it a predication? He's a God, like he's divine, and no one's ever going to face that because they're just going to capitalize the G and not worry about it.
Right.
But I mean, other things too, like just simple things like Godhead.
Yeah, that's a good example.
This is one of my big pet peeves. Like anytime I hear someone use the word Godhead, I'm just like, this person probably doesn't know what they're about to be talking about.
Right, because Godhead, the way modern English users use it now, is very similar to like what you might think that the Greek word trias would have meant, right? Because it's like English speakers use Godhead to use the people's, the persons that are God.
Yeah, they do. They
it's
use
a plural referring. Yeah.
They talk about the Godhead, and it's like, yeah, this is a singular noun, but it kind of refers to the three persons, but in a weird way, so you're not really quite sure what's going on. And I don't know who, anyway, for the benefit of someone who might be watching it doesn't know, but it's just, you know, in Old English, people would talk about like monkhead or fatherhead, or it's a beautiful
manhead,
the neighborhead, manhead, like that was just the ending was head instead of hood. And so, but like, because no one wants to break with that tradition, it's like, well, we'll still like, even in the, you know, it's like the 21st century now, and we're still saying Godhead because we won't just change it to Godhood. But then, like a lot of the stuff that they're talking, like when people talk about there are three persons in the Godhead, like if you change that to there are three persons in the Godhood or the Godness, it's like, well, what do you mean? Do you just mean there's like there's a species that has three members in it, or like what do you like? What? But that's kind of not all they want to mean. They want it to mean something more and kind of sound profound or whatever. But a lot of that
and
is
it's that being sort of thing, right? They want the Godhead to be something like a being, but really, it like the best modern English equivalent would be like divinity or something, right? Like the thing that makes gods, right?
The quality of being divine, or in
the quality of which would be a useful word if we actually had a good one for it, like Godhood. If that was a common English word, that could clear up a lot of the misconceptions.
Well, that's another thing to think about. This, like we've had words in English that were perfectly good ways of talking about the abstract quality of being divine. We had deity, like that is literally like aseity, or you know, like it's the quality of being the quality of being a deus is deity. And in Latin, that's pretty much what it, you know, it's like deitas, the quality of being divine. But now, like, because people who were speaking English had a certain theology, they wanted the word deity to mean something more than just that. And so now it does. Like now a deity is like Zeus is a deity, right? Like Athena is like now it is an individual God. And then we had divinity, but then like now that also can kind of mean like, I mean, you can say like Zeus is a divinity or something.
Right, right. English keeps wanting to not have a word that means the quality
Yeah.
of being God,
Yeah.
but not the it's like the what of
I think
God.
what really
God is
happens is
what?
I think you get translations of stuff from the church fathers where they're saying like there's three persons, but there's one ousia, there's one, or one theotis, like there's one godhood,
Mhm.
and that's not quite enough to answer the questions that people are having about it. And so like they want that to mean something deeper, and it doesn't. It just is what it is. Like if you want the rest of the explanation, you got to kind of go elsewhere. But like that, they want it to be doing more work, and so like the meaning of those English words then just starts to shift.
Yeah, and I think this was something that I tried to communicate with Chris Date about in the debate discussion thing. I don't think I did my most eloquent job, but the distinction between using God in terms of what or using God in terms of who. And this
Yeah,
is why I think like in modern American evangelical Trinitarianism, when you say Jesus is God, you mean that in terms of who, right? And there's like
right.
some meta who is God, and then there
Yeah,
are three sub who's who are the one
yeah,
who, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
there is no what there. It's just a bunch of who language. And then it
yeah.
gets either modalistic or very mysterious or just downright contradictory.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think, and I mean, we talked about this last time that in Greek you've got God with the definite article, and then it's a referential
Mhm.
use of God, and that's a who, and that even into the church fathers, like they tend to reserve that for God the Father,
Right.
and then you've got theos without the article. That's a predicate.
That's Godhood, if we still
Yeah,
had
that's
an
this,
English
this
word.
thing is
Yeah.
divine and so forth. Um,
Hmm.
which doesn't necessarily, I mean, it doesn't answer questions about how many gods there are and that sort of thing, but it does, at least it's keeps that distinction clear where, I think people kind of deliberately want to like make that fuzzy and unclear,
Hmm.
or they want it to be that, yeah, Jesus is like the God, um,
Right.
somehow is, but also isn't, and then it's like, well, what's going on?
Right.
Uh,
Right. That's interesting. Um, so yeah, so I guess that getting to our first question
yeah,
that
of
we
course.
sort of agreed to
Yeah,
talk about.
right. Yeah.
So one thing that sort of arose sort of as a point of disagreement
Mhm.
between you and biblical Unitarianism in your sort of address to Dale Tuggy is the
Mhm.
question of God eternally, the God eternally and necessarily being a father.
Mhm.
And honestly, I've read some amount about like the Arian controversy and stuff like
Mhm.
that. But after we talked, I reread How Jesus Became God by Rubinstein. I forget,
Mhm.
it's because there's How Jesus Became God or When Jesus Became God. One's by Bart Ehrman and one's by Rubinstein. I forget which one's which. It was a popular book
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
But I reread that and I was like, oh my goodness, this makes so much more sense. Like
Oh,
the distinctions between what the Arians and the Nicenes or anti-Arians were arguing about. So one thing that you really helped me realize is one of the central pieces of their debate was whether God
mhm.
needed to necessarily and eternally be Father.
Right. Right.
And so
Yeah.
part of me, so I guess you pointed out that Dale Tuggy in his definition sort of got himself in a little bit of a jam. If Unitarianism is believing that God is the one that Jesus referred to as Father, and that's
Yeah.
eternally the case, um, perhaps that needs some
Yeah.
clarifying. And so I was thinking about that, and I couldn't think of any reason why I wouldn't be okay with saying that God doesn't need to always have been the Father, or need to always have been Jesus' Father.
Right. So I, I think that's right. I mean, I think if you're a biblical Unitarian, you want to say God has not always been the Father, because
Right.
otherwise you've got this eternal and uncreated Son. And a lot of us think like, finite, imperfect beings are contingent
Mhm.
by nature. So he'd have to end up being divine if he was not created. So I
Right.
think you want to say, yeah, God hasn't always been a father, and hasn't always had a son. There hasn't always been a son, and so forth. Um, I think the way Dale formulated his definitions, you get the result that, I mean, if it's necessary, if it's what does he say? It's eternally the case that how did he put it? Anyway, that God is the Father. God is identical to the one that Jesus called Father, or whatever, however he puts it.
Sure. And I'm sure Dale would be fine being like, oh, I didn't mean it quite like that. I meant
Yeah,
like
yeah. I mean, I don't know
that
with
person who Jesus called Father, that individual has always been the only God, not that Jesus is eternally calling God his Father. But
yeah, I guess I'd have to go through and see if there's if tweaking those definitions causes problems in his arguments elsewhere or not. But
that would
uh,
be so.
it,
So I
it
guess
might not be a huge problem. But yeah, I think that's what you want to say. But yeah, I don't think you want to say that it's eternally the case that God is the Father of Jesus Christ.
right. So I guess my question is like, honestly, I'd never really thought about that question very much.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I don't know, to me, I just don't see, it doesn't seem to immediately raise any difficulties or
Right.
problems for me. I'm
Mm.
like, well, God's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? But that doesn't mean that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are co-eternal. God's a creator, but that doesn't mean that creation is eternal, right? And in the same
Right.
way, God is the Father of Jesus Christ, but that doesn't mean that Jesus Christ needs to be eternal for him to still be able to be called the Father of Jesus.
Yeah, so there's I was thinking about this when you sent your questions over, and actually I've been talking to uh, some of my friends about this. So there's a number of arguments that come up during the Arian controversy about this issue. Some of them, to be honest, there's some of them that I'm have a hard time parsing. I'm not quite sure what the. So in particular, there's one that I'm kind of thinking about more lately that involves God being immutable, so he doesn't change. And I'm actually at this point, I can't say that I'm quite clear on why the Nicenes think there's a big difference between being a father and being the creator. And they seem to think that going from being a non-father to a father would be a change of a sort that be going from not creator to a creator wouldn't be, or something like this. But anyway, so some of them I'm not quite sure myself how they work, but I can say a few things about some of the arguments that I think I grasp a little bit better. So one kind of involves, I mean, it does involves an issue of change, but anyway, one idea is essentially that fatherhood is a perfection. So it's a divine perfection. In the same way that God is, eternally and essentially omnipotent or omniscient and omnibenevolent and so forth, that being a father is one of those things, right? It's one of these great making kind of qualities or whatever. And the argument is sort of, I mean, it's basically kind of like, look, in your own case, do you feel like being a father is a good thing? It's kind of the way they put it to the Arian sort of opponents. And the argument is something like this. It's creatures don't, like we don't, how do I want to put this? I mean, essentially the idea is that creation is something that's kind of neutral from God's point of view. I mean, it's good for us that God created us, but it's, God would have been just as well off, so to speak, whether he had created any finite beings or not. But that having a son is kind of a good thing is one of their arguments. Now, I don't know, I don't know how, well, I guess I can say a little bit more about that. I can see that some people might not find that super persuasive. They might think, well, yeah, I mean, I like having a son or daughter or whatever, but maybe my life would just be as fine, without something. But so to flesh the argument out a little more, the way it goes is just kind of like, if you say that, so one option would be to say that having a son is a bad thing. That would be to say that God went from being perfectly happy and blessed and, whatever, to being worse off. And now, it would kind of be blasphemous, right, to say that having a son was a bad thing. If you say, on the other hand, that having a son was a good thing, that's good for God, then you're saying that God has improved, like God's position has kind of improved over time, so to speak. He hasn't just like always eternally been blessed and perfectly well off and happy and so forth because he got a bump up, so to speak, when he had a son. So your only other option then would be to say that it's neutral. But then their worry is like that's almost kind of blasphemous too. I mean, to just say like, yeah, like Jesus is just kind of a neutral thing. Like there's really no value, like good or bad, to having this son or whatever. So if none of those options are really quite satisfactory, I mean, then their argument is, well, then we better get rid of the change issue and just have an eternal son. So you might wonder about that. Like, so I think some people, I've tried to think through like, well, how would I respond to that if I was a biblical Unitarian? Well, I wouldn't want to say that Jesus is bad or like having a son is a bad deal for God or something. That seems blasphemous. I guess you could think through like whether you think it's okay that God hasn't always been perfectly blessed or happy or whatever. I mean, that was a pretty common assumption at the time, that nothing that creatures can do can really harm God or benefit God. So, but he's perfectly happy and whatever. But so the question whether having a son is a good thing, if it is, but that's a change, then it looks like, well, God went from not perfectly happy to better. Some people might be okay with that. I'm not sure whether I would be.
No, I see there's something of a point there.
Yeah, the neutral issue. So one thing that I've thought about is, I mean, some people might just say like, well, I don't know if this harms or benefits God. It's just maybe something that he did or something. But one thing that I would point to that I think the fathers aren't maybe making explicit, but might be in the back of their mind, is just if you think through the Old Testament, like in a way, like the greatest blessing that God ever gives people is children.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, so it's like Abraham and Sarah don't have a son, and it's like, hey, here's the big deal, like for you is I'm going to give you this son in your old age. And there's a number of people, Hannah and Samuel and so forth, like where this happened, that like they didn't have any children, and the big blessing that they really wanted was a child, and then God says, okay, I'll give, even really with Adam and Eve, right? Like after the fall, like God says, but I'm going to give you this seed, and he will, you know, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
prophecy about the Messiah and so forth. So I do think, like, if you really think through kind of the cultural background, like the biblical kind of background, like fatherhood is seen as this like huge blessing, like maybe the greatest blessing that God gives people is to be a mother or a father. And that's not something we think about, I think, today, because our culture is like congratulations, you're not the father. You know,
Yeah.
like we think it's, oh yeah, it's his responsibility or something. But like in that culture, it was absolutely not. It was like fatherhood is the, you know, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, you know, this is one of these things, like as an analytic philosopher, I kind of it's like, well, I don't know, I could try to, you know, map that all out in predicate logic or something, like, well, there's premises here that you could kind of deny. So it's maybe not like, you know, this rock solid kind of argument, but I think I do think, like, once you get your head around it, it's you can at least kind of understand that, yeah, I mean, there is a question there, right? Like, is this does this fit with that kind of cultural view that fatherhood is a blessing, fatherhood is one of the greatest things that, you know, you could want, and kind of how do I think about that? Do I want to think about things in the same way or what?
Mm-hmm.
A different, I don't know, maybe I'll stop there before there's another argument that I've thought about, but I don't know if you want to chime in on that or just ramble on
Yeah.
to another
Well,
argument.
I suppose reacting to that, like, you know, I see a little bit what you're saying. You know, I, you know, feel blessed when I became a father.
Mhm.
So would, you know, but, you know, God in the Old Testament does seem to get blessed or get angry or get upset and at multiple
Mhm.
things, if we're being honest, I guess.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
calling create, like, you know, I guess this is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased, right? The message from the baptism. Um, you know, I see a little bit of what that's saying, but I don't feel like that's digging in me. Like it's like, yeah, God became a father, but it's not like it changed him. I don't know. It just doesn't seem to have the oomph in it.
Yeah, maybe rather than going on to other arguments about that, it might be nice to shift gears, because I think this is something that people don't get and that is really important. So like you were saying, yeah, God in the Old Testament changes and, you know, does this, that, and the other. So a huge difference, and it's always kind of weird to like generalize, because everyone's like, no, I don't believe that, and I've always believed that. But I feel like when I was a Baptist, that was how I thought about things. Like the God of the Old Testament is God the Father, and then the God of the New Testament, or I mean, whatever. In the New Testament, we find out like, hey, everybody, congratulations, I had a son, and he is, and whatever. Um, so in Orthodoxy, really the God of the Old Testament is the Son. So like all of that stuff, like most of the time when you're talking about Yahweh or Elohim in the Old Testament, it's God the Son. And I think
Really,
that's, yeah. So I'm glad that you're shocked at that, because
I am
I feel
shocked.
like, yeah. Well, that's good, because I really do think like that's something, I think that people don't get that, and don't know about that. But anyway, sometimes people, you know what I mean? I mean, sometimes people are like, oh, everyone knows that. But anyway, yeah, that's, and I think it's a big deal because I think that presupposition, let me put it this way. I think that a lot of times when I talk to Unitarians or anybody, any Protestants or Catholics or whatever, that presupposition is going on in the background. I think they don't even realize that there's a difference of opinion. I was actually emailing Dale not too long ago because I invited him to put a paper in this issue of a journal that I'm editing. So, and he and I corresponded for a little bit talking about edits on the paper and stuff. And at one point and I didn't get into it because there was other stuff we were talking about, but at one point he was like, well, blah, blah, blah. I assume this is because you think that Yahweh from the Old Testament is God the Father and blah, blah, blah. And then I didn't really pick up the thread with him, but I was like, yeah, not really. So here's what I would say. Here's kind of how I would explain it. I think that a lot of kind of Trinitarian, like your standard Joe Western Trinitarian, will probably say things like, there's places in the Old Testament where Yahweh means the Trinity, right? Or Elohim means the Trinity. Like they'll say that.
Let us make man in our image.
Let us make man in our image, right? And that's God talking to himself like, hey, man, let us do stuff. But I'll get back to that verse hopefully later. But anyway, there's places where they're going to say like, yeah, see, here's this thing with the Trinity. Or there might be places where they say like, here Yahweh means the Son. But it's kind of like 3% of the time or something, right? And it's like 97% of the time it's God the Father.
Mm-hmm.
I would say like an Orthodox reading of the Old Testament would have, I mean, I'm just kind of pulling numbers out of the air, but I don't know, like 70% of the time in the Old Testament, it's the Son.
Really?
Yeah, and like maybe 25 or something % of the time, it's the Father. So there's a big chunk of time, like, so there's a big chunk of the references to Yahweh and Elohim in the Old Testament where it's the Father, but the majority are the Son. Yeah. And
I'm a little gobsmacked.
Yeah, so I'm glad because I feel like even if, I mean, surely you disagree with that, but at least like it's at least something to know, right? That's not just like it's not common ground, right? So, in fact, if you're interested in this, I've been going through trying to like read through the Orthodox Study Bible in a year, kind of thing, whatever, and the study notes are good for that if you want to know like where and I kind of know like why it is, so I'm going through and kind of doing my own little study, but it's interesting for me to just see like, oh yeah, the people that put the notes in here, like they get it, they're on the same page here. So I mean, just, I don't know, I won't pick a thing out at random, but I mean, it's like, when Yahweh descends in the cloud to the tent of tabernacle and talks to Moses, like the study notes in this thing will be like, here the Son of God speaks to Moses, blah, blah, saying blah, blah, blah. And the reason for that is that, and this is, if you want to like actually know where the doctrine of the Trinity comes from, which is another thing, I think people get all these like, even scholars do this, like they get into all these acrobatics with like, it must be Platonism or something, and there's actually multiple, I mean, there's a lot of different forces in play there, but like a huge issue, one of the central issues, if not the central issue, is this issue about whether God can be seen or not.
Yeah.
Or heard. And so if you take very seriously and just in a very straightforward way so even just what the Old Testament says, right? When God says, no one can see me and live,
mm-hmm.
But then Moses in fact does see God, and not just Moses, but like the 70 elders see God, and then like, various of the judges and different people like see God all the time, and they kind of flip out. So they're like, whoa, I saw God and I lived. I can't believe I saw it. Even before God says you can't see me and live, like Jacob, when he wrestles with the angel, and when he says, I've seen God face to face and I lived. So if you take all that very seriously, then you have to kind of go back through and say, well, then, any time that God is visible, that must, this has got to be so. And then there's then the angel of the Lord is often referred to as God, right? Or Yahweh. And so you have to kind of go back and think, well, then those must be the angel of the Lord. Like that must just all be some second figure, right? That can be seen. And then Tyler and I have been talking about this a lot. He's getting more and more interested in this stuff. So the interesting thing, if you've read Two Powers in Heaven, Alan Segal, he talks about, he focuses, he doesn't talk as much about the visibility invisibility issue, but he does talk about this phenomenon that was already kind of going on in the first century, even probably before Christ was born, where there were one power theologies and two power theologies, as he calls them. And anyway, you can see a lot of these two power verses and arguments and things that pop up in the Talmud later and so forth. You can see those being discussed by church fathers who speak Greek and don't know any Hebrew, and kind of mess things up sometimes. Like they'll quote the same verses in the same context, but sometimes it doesn't really make sense because they don't know the Hebrew. But it's kind of clear that that must have come out of this thing. But one of the things that they all talk about, so like Irenaeus, Justin Martyr, Theophilus of Antioch, Athenagoras, like all these guys make this point. They say, well, the God and Father of all can't be located in a particular point in space. He's infinite. Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool and all that. He can't be seen, he can't be heard, and so forth. So they're very insistent that all of these things are the Son of God. And the interesting thing is that in the New Testament, it looks like you do have these statements in the New Testament that are like,
no one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten Son. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, that's exactly right. And that's exactly the sort of thing that these two powers Jews would say. Like, those are the sorts of arguments that they would make. And the thing Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. There's a number of those things, the enthronement. So that's one of the things that the Jewish two powers people talked about a lot, was there's a number of these things that talk about an enthronement where it either looks like there's two thrones, or there's a throne and a figure that's at the right hand of the throne, or there's, in Revelation, then of course you get two people sitting on the throne. You get the Lamb and God sit, on the throne or whatever. So anyway, it looks like that's kind of probably what the origin of a lot of this stuff is, and it's something that I do wish that I would hear more. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess I can say I wish I could hear more from biblical Unitarians about this, but I understand that it's not something that is emphasized much by Western Trinitarian apologists as much.
Well, it's getting more common. I've certainly interacted with some two powers in heaven-y sort of arguments for the Trinity, which to me it's like, well, 2 and 3 aren't the same number, but I'm listening. But this idea, that there was Jewish complexity in the Godhead, like Richard Bauckham, I think I'm saying, he's sort of a big proponent of that, of sort of, melding Trinitarian developments with sort of Jewish divine identity complexity. And honestly, I'm not enough of an expert on that. Like, this is something that I've only this is a new argument that I'm confronting. My initial gut reaction is that seems a little bit like a stretch, but because it seems.
How so?
Well, so I guess I would say that my impression of Judaism, both in terms of modern Judaism and sort of thinking back on what I always sort of thought about Judaism, is that it was very monotheistic, right? In terms of Yahweh being just one being, and perhaps this is a little bit growing up biblical Unitarian also. But I mean, I had a lot of Jewish friends that I like to discuss theology with, and that it was just very monotheistic, and this idea of there being some sort of complexity in God just was never really there. But
that's the view that Alan Segal and others, I mean, other Jewish authors like Daniel Boyarin is one of my favorite guys. I mean, he's an Orthodox Jew, and I mean, basically his thesis is there is absolutely nothing original about Christianity except the particular Jewish carpenter that we've kind of like slotted into this pre-existing.
I've heard that a couple times now. But my reaction is like, it seemed like the Jews at the time really disliked the idea of the Trinity or its antecedents. In Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, which I should read again, but it seems like he depicts Trypho as not being down, right? Trypho's the Jewish guy, right? It seems like he depicts Trypho as not being down with this sort of Logos style thing that Justin has going on with God.
I mean, Trypho is a one power theologian.
Yes. Okay.
What the view is, so here's kind of the view as I understand it. So the only thing we really know for sure about first century Palestinian Judaism, ironically, is from the New Testament. It's kind of a funny predicament to be in, right? But I mean, it's like literally, it's like, I don't know, are these guys the most reliable? Like, that, the gospel writers may have not been super sympathetic to the Jews, at the time.
Right. Well, there's Philo and Josephus and stuff like that.
So there's Philo who I do think that Philo is a reliable source in that regard, but a lot of people have traditionally, so here's the, okay, say like 100, 200 years ago or something, scholars would have thought kind of what you're saying, like Jews have just always been super monotheistic and there's no complexity in God, it's just, for that reason, when they read, so when you read about the doctrine of the Trinity, it's like, well, where did that come from, right? And your options are basically like, well, it came from Judaism, but forget about that. That doesn't sound right. Or it's some kind of pagan Greek influence from the Greco-Roman culture that surrounded them or something, right? Which is kind
I vote option 2, but I'm curious and becoming more open to option 1.
Or 3, like it's just divine inspiration or something, or it's like, Jesus just taught this, and it'd be kind of crazy to for the disciples to think that for any other reason or something. And those have been kind of the options. And I think what's happened with scholarship in the last 3 or 4 decades or whatever, maybe 5 decades now. So we've just thought that like that first option just wasn't an option, that it didn't come out of Judaism, right? And I think that it's just sort of like the facts just have not been very kind to the second option. Like that was something that was part of a kind of Hegelian program. Hegel and his followers kind of liked the idea, because Hegel thinks everything has to be a synthesis of opposites, and Hegel liked the Trinity, so he wants the Trinity to be a synthesis of opposites, right? So Hegel loved the Trinity, and he and followers of his like Bauer and others like think, okay, well you have this like overly super monotheistic Jewish theology, right? And that's deficient for some reason or whatever and has problems. And then you've got this overly polytheistic, pagan thing, and that's got its problems. And then they combine, and you've got this Hegelian synthesis that's the Trinity, and that's the Goldilocks, like just right view, because that's kind of Hegel's philosophy. But of course, what's happened is then scholars initially, I think, after Hegel, like absorbed that picture, sans facts. I mean, it's not that they didn't really have sources to back it up so much, but it's just like they took that picture, but not everybody believed in the same sort of value judgments. Like not everybody thought, yeah, the truth is like in the future or like in the end. A lot of people, conservative types like probably yourself and me, and like think, well, no, whatever was the original, revelation, or like that's the right thing, and so they kind of view that as a corruption. I think that so the thing is when you go back and try to look for like sources and influences and things, like a lot of those theories haven't really panned out, and I think there's an ironic thing happening right now where there are these kind of evangelical Christians who are really not happy about this Jewish, like people like Segal and Boyarin coming along and saying like, yeah, actually, probably this was going on in Judaism, like in the first century and whatever, because what the evangelical guys, I think, have had going for them, at least within academia, is they could say, well, just a priori, we can rule out Judaism as a source for the Trinity. And looking into actual parallels between, influences from pagan culture and whatever, like that hasn't really seemed to be as profitable as looking at Jewish stuff. And so if you can rule out those two, then it's kind of like, hey, what's left? But just, it's just, because the apostles were so whatever, about Jesus, they always believed that he was God, and it's divine, and it's this new revelation, and blah, blah, blah. Which I actually, as an Orthodox Christian, don't want to believe, because I want to think that it was in the Old Testament. From it's not a new thing. It's just I mean, some of in a sense it's a revelation, but in a sense it was always there. So I actually like the Jewish guys, but I think a lot of the evangelical types don't necessarily like it, or they want to try to spin it a certain way or something. So there's still something.
There certainly are some evangelicals who seem to like trying to dovetail that Jewish complexity with the Trinity. Yeah. Like the Bauckham NT Wright crowd does, and Michael Heiser certainly seems to like that idea.
Yeah, that's true. I think
there is that crowd, and the Preston Sprinkle, the guy who hosted the debate that I had with Chris Date, he seems to be a Bauckham fan. So there's certainly some of that around. I don't know. I feel
I was going to flesh out something though. The story that these Jewish scholars are telling though is that so that complexity was there in Palestinian Judaism in the first century, and we don't get the Mishnah starting to be written down until about 200 AD or so. And then we don't get the full, like the Talmud until like 400 AD. And the story is that essentially the Jewish rabbis, I mean, these are the descendants of the Pharisees, right? And by the time the Mishnah starts getting written down, like they're not happy with Christianity, right? So
it's like the counter-Christianization of Judaism.
Right. So I mean, the idea is they started telling a story about how we have never believed this stuff. This has never been part of Judaism. This is just crazy. We've always thought and these guys are just heretics, and it's they're way out of line. And it's, I mean, if you think about it, it's a little bit like, I mean, if you think about like Arianism, right? The reality is Arians had all the same church services and hymns and rituals, and they were part of the same church and had the same bishops and hierarchs and stuff. And I mean, in reality, they shared like 99% of stuff in common with the Orthodox, and it was just a big heated controversy over a certain particular doctrinal issue. You know, maybe one that has huge consequences, you know, for other stuff. But it became this thing, like now the mythology is like these people are this crazy, you know, like totally different thing, and it's like, well, historically that's not really
right. I with some of my Eastern Orthodox friends, I gave them a pop quiz. I had 6 quotes. 3 were from Athanasius and 3 were from Arius, and I had them guess, you know, which ones it was, and it's like impossible to tell, right? I was like,
I've often actually thought about that exact same experiment. I've thought, like, I would like to just get quotes from like the Arians and the Orthodox and just be like, can you even tell like which is which?
Yeah.
How were the results? Were they
most of them didn't even, most were like, we see your point without giving, don't make us commit to giving answers.
Yeah, interesting.
And so yeah, I think like Arius was way closer to orthodoxy than someone like, say, William Lane Craig's Trinity is, or something like that. And or even like, I think Athanasius and Arius were closer to each other than Athanasius and Augustine. And that's
I actually think that's right.
And so that's a weird thing. And another thing that's part of the mythology of the Arian controversy that just seems so wrong is that Arianism was new, whereas whereas Nicene-ism was old. And the Arians were the whole time like, no, this is what we've always thought. And they would be like, Justin Martyr agreed with us. And then the Nicenes would be like, no, he agrees with us. And they're like, no, right? They thought, I feel like in the grand scheme of early Christian Christology, I sort of said this in my talk with Chris Date, that I think there's sort of like 4 camps. There's like the dynamic monarchians, who I would say are the proto-biblical Unitarians, that I think that I would probably have been close to agreeing with. There's Gnostics, there's modalists, and then there's sort of logos theorists, which would include both Arians and Nicenes, and that really the Arian controversy was a civil war in sort of the camp that ended up winning.
Yeah, I think that's roughly right.
Yeah, but that's interesting. To be honest, I think I need to learn more about this complexity in the Godhead stuff. I would be overextending myself if I claimed to be an expert on it, but I've been getting this argument multiple times recently, so it's probably time that I start to do my homework more on that. But I will say that it seems pretty clear to me that one can draw a pretty convincing story, at least I find it pretty convincing, of the mix of Middle and Neoplatonism, with Christianity being sort of my main explanation and understanding of where the Trinity eventually came from. And like if you look at like Origen of Alexandria and Plotinus being basically peers and probably even knowing each other, like I think the parallels between them are very striking, and like sort of the idea of there being this cascade of 3 beings and stuff like that in Platonism seems to me very, very similar to a lot of the ideas. And like even the word homoousios itself came from, Gnostic Hermeticism and like pagan Gnosticism that had kind of this relationship between a highest ineffable being and sort of an emissary logos being from it. So I feel like I find that story pretty convincing, and that I don't think it's just a Hegelian idea either, that's where it came from. Like the earliest biblical Unitarians after the Reformation also made that same point, but they were making that point in like the 1500s, before Hegelianism, that
Yeah,
that the Trinity is a Platonic a Platonic corruption of more pure, modalistic or dynamic monarchian sort of theology.
Yeah, I guess the question is, are we presupposing, or are we just kind of assuming that there's nothing in common between Plato and the New Testament?
Right.
If you just start out with the presupposition, like there's no common ground here, right? Then, I guess you can find some similarities with Plato, or references to Plato or whatever, and say, well, if this is like Plato, they must have gotten it from Plato, because they couldn't have gotten Platonism out of the New Testament. You might hate to be in one of my philosophy classes, because I go through the Republic. I teach at a Catholic school here, and I have, sometimes I have seminarians or nuns or whatever coming through that are going to be studying theology and stuff. And so I'll point out that, overlap or similarities, as we kind of go through. And this was not something that was pointed out to me when I was an undergraduate, studying philosophy or anything. But there's a massive amount of Plato in the New Testament. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just, look, a stop clock is right twice a day. Sometimes people say stuff that's right. And there's, the stuff about Plato that anyone would agree, like, well, that's not compatible with Christianity. Oh, that's not in the New Testament. But the stuff that is compatible, like, it is there. And it's clear, like, it's absolutely clear. Like, there's all, it's not so clear in English, because I've noticed this, and this has been a pet peeve of mine for a long, long time, that when you look at the Greek and then you look at the English translations, the people who are translating Plato don't want to believe that Plato was very religious, and they don't translate things in that way, even when he's saying things that are pretty clearly like getting into religious ideas, whatever. And the people who translate the New Testament and the Church Fathers, sometimes they don't want to think that, or they don't want to translate it like this is coming from Plato or something. So you get differences in the English translations that obscure when people are using the same exact terms and phrases, and it's. I just think that I just wrote. I may end up having to edit it down for length, so I don't know how much of this I'm going to have to chop out, but I just wrote an introduction for this. I just wrote a chapter for a book that I get into this. There's a lot of stuff going on in the New Testament that's in Plato, but it's not in the Old Testament.
Yeah, like especially the book of Hebrews. Wow. No, there are a couple times in the Old Testament where God will get referred to with father language.
Yahweh says things like, "You're like a son to me."
Yeah, and then there's some reverse where the prophets or whatever.
There's 200, or no, that's God. Anyway, point being, there's the Father, and God in the New Testament is not just called like the Father of Jesus,
right? Our Father who art in heaven. Yeah,
he's our Father, and a lot of times he's just the Father, and that's never in the Old Testament, but that's in the Republic.
Yeah, I agree with that. There is some. So I don't want to make some biblical Unitarians put a much sharper edge on that point than I want to. Like, oh, Plato bad, Judaism good, right? Or Revelation good, philosophy bad, or something like that. And I don't think that is true. Like, I think clearly the book of Hebrews shows a lot of Platonic thinking,
Yeah.
right? There's the heavenly example of the temple, and then there's the temporary earthly tabernacle, right? There's the heaven. Jesus is now the heavenly high priest for eternity, but down here the priesthood was just sort of temporary and always had to continually doing it, right? You know, that's very Platonic, and I think it's clear that that wasn't even just like an interesting convergence. I would think that was the author of the Hebrews had some amount of Platonic education or influence directly or indirectly.
I have another book that you'll hate. I haven't gotten to this yet, actually, but this guy, I'm interested to see what he's going to be saying. It's Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible. Demirkin, I think, is his way you pronounce his name. But anyway, I don't anticipate being persuaded. But anyway, he argues that he's convinced that the Torah was modeled after Plato, and so he actually late dates the Torah to about the same time as the Septuagint, which I think is kind of like, whoa, but the funny thing about it, is just that he sees so much in common between Plato and the Torah.
That's interesting.
He's just there's no other way to account for this than just to say that it won. Which is funny to me because the church fathers used to always
did the opposite.
Like Plato's just plagiarizing off of Moses, and so people would always say, "Oh, that's so ridiculous." The church fathers trying to say Plato copied off Moses, but here you've got this like modern scholar who's like, I don't know. It's just too much. The only way this could have happened is if they copied off Plato, and so. It's a really radical view too. I think he believes that the Torah was written like at the same time as the Septuagint. Like they were just the same. Like it wasn't created and then translated. It was just like, let's write this in Greek and Hebrew at the same time because he has to shove it that far.
Yeah, interesting.
Which is like I said. I don't.
I know.
Thing.
Yeah,
I don't anticipate. Coming away from it like fully persuaded of all that, but
color me skeptical on that one.
Yeah,
but I think
it's interesting.
I think another thing that I would say.
Oh, go ahead. No.
Is that Platonism, like Middle and Neoplatonism, was also much more different and developed in its own thing than Plato, right? Like the Plato of 400 BC is different than like the early middle and then Neoplatonists. Like they seem to get a lot out of the Timaeus that I don't see, right? Like in terms of this the one and then the nous and all these things. And so I think that Platonist, that pagan Platonist strain that really seems to start in maybe the 1st century BC or so was sort of its own thing and had its own vitality and its own development of ideas, and that it sort of was very close to Christianity because it was mainly happening in Alexandria at about the same time that Christianity was growing in Alexandria. And there seems to be some amount of cross-intertwining, especially in Alexandria itself, that I think really is sort of the development of that kind of Platonically, and by Platonic I mean more like Platonismist interaction between Christian theology and pagan philosophy. And that's what I think really that's that whole complex, that interaction is where I think the Trinity comes.
It's interesting that you mentioned Alexandria. That's one of the things I talk about in this chapter is the extent to which Christianity in its origins is kind of intertwined with Alexandria in a way that people don't always necessarily pick up on. So you have this claim in the Gospel of Matthew that the Holy Family, fled to Egypt for a few years or whatever. So which like 99% of Jews that were living in Egypt would have been living in Alexandria. Like
yeah,
would have been where they would have been.
That's like almost what Egypt meant to them, was the city of Alexandria. Yeah,
that's
right. I agree with that. And when kind of modern people hear that, they think pyramids and camels, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like just out in the desert, like and it's like, no, that was Alexandria, and that was
the biggest city in the world.
Well, and even in Luke, you know, you get like Jesus in the temple when he's 12 years old, arguing with people, and they're like, where did he get all this knowledge? And it's like, well, if you put those two together, like the implication is kind of like, well, he was in, I mean, Alexandria was the center of learning, you know. Israel wasn't, like, but Alexandria, but also Apollos, right? So people pick up on that is, and it's a weird thing, right? So Apollos, no one knows because he's just kind of mentioned here and there, but there's no book by him or something. But so a couple of things are really wonky about Apollos, who's from Alexandria. It says he's a native of Alexandria. One is that, you know, when there's this big schism that Paul talks about, like some people say, I'm of Apollos and I'm of Paul, and it's like he's ranked with Peter, Paul, and Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, so at the time, he must have been a pretty dang big deal, right, in early Christian circles, if that's. And then the other thing that's really weird, though, is like, so he just kind of comes out of nowhere, out being from Alexandria, and it says that he was preaching accurately the things concerning Christ. But that was before he was ever baptized or had ever even met a Christian. Like, he knew the baptism of John, it says. And then so like Priscilla and Aquila have to take him aside, and they expounded things to him more perfectly. So they kind of, but it's like, well, how does he know accurately from the scriptures so much stuff about Jesus if he's never even so much as like encountered a Christian that could baptize him? I mean, so it looks like, well, it must be, I mean, my explanation is there's some pre-existing theology from Alexandria that he's just figured out that Jesus plugs into.
I would say that Apollos would be my number one guess for who wrote the book of Hebrews.
Really interesting.
Like, I wouldn't bet my life on that. I would bet my life on not Apollos. I wouldn't give him, better odds than 50-50, but if you ask me my best guess, it would be him. Because it does sound more Platonic than any of the other books. And him being from Alexandria, that would make sense. And so, that does get me wondering about my story of cross-contamination and how early that was. But I still think that it really, in its earliest stages, like, I think the book of Hebrews, a lot of Trinitarians like the book of Hebrews as a way to kind of demonstrate some things. But to me, I like the book of Hebrews as like one of my favorite books, because I think one of the biggest differences that I think we would still have between us, you and me, is that I imagine Jesus getting exalted to things that he hasn't had before, right? I don't imagine a coming down, doing stuff, and then sort of going back sort of story. I imagine, like, new human person who then gets exalted into extremely heavenly power and authority and glory. And that I think that Hebrews is one of the clearest demonstrations of that. Like especially that image, like the clearest image to me is like, he talks about how the earthly tabernacle and the earthly temple had the Holy of Holies, right? And only the high priest could go in there, and he had to bring an offering of blood. And we kind of talked about this a little bit in our first talk. And then he talks about how Jesus now enters into the Holy of Holies, not in the earthly temple, but in the true heavenly reflection of the temple, and that he does it covered in his own blood as his own sacrifice, right? And that, like, and it seems to be, I forget exactly which chapter this is, but he seemingly enters into the Holy of Holies as the high priest once and for all. And it seems like a new thing that happens after Jesus is exalted into the heavenly realm. And to me, that would seem like a very weird thing to say about a pre-existent son.
I think that's an ingenious response. It is funny because it's ironic because that's the go-to place for for people to talk about pre-existence, and so I think you make a good point. But it does. I mean, it does talk about, seem to talk about anyway, Jesus being the one through whom God create, in whom all things consist, and so forth. So. I wonder if there's not just kind of some kind of tension within that book. It's interesting though that it's interesting to have that sort of contrast in a single book though, because when it's in different books of the New Testament, you can kind of say like, well, maybe it was just different authors had different theologies and this is all contradictory or something. But when it's like, oh, this is clearly the work of one author. So, yeah,
I guess my way on that particular topic is that I think that this is something that I've had evolving views on. Like the biblical Unitarian crowd is also having this big infight about and about whether or not a lot of the passages that connect Jesus with creating, whether it's John 1, Colossians 1 and 2, and Hebrews 1, are really seemingly kind of the three places where seemingly Jesus or the Logos gets connected with the act of creation. I think with Hebrews especially, it might be especially clear that it's the new creation that's being talked about, and not the original Genesis 1 ex nihilo creation. And that it seems to me, I think that it's easiest to make that argument with Hebrews. I think it's hardest to make that argument with John. And that with Hebrews, there's this big contrast between the old way of things and the new way of things. And that I think that what he's saying is Jesus is the one through whom the new way of things is coming in. And that what sounds like creation is not about first time, not about Genesis 1, but about like the new creation.
I've heard that argument before. You know what I was thinking? If we do this again, it might be interesting to, like, for us to get together a couple of papers or book chapters or something for both of us to read and get back on talk about it. Because somebody say it's like, okay, I'm sort of vaguely familiar with this approach, but maybe if I like read a paper where it was laid out in detail, I'd be more like, oh, okay, that's like, I can see the connections there or something. I mean, I do get what you're saying, like the creation could be a reference to the new creation. But sometimes I feel like it's probably the case that like, so, I mean, people have kind of a web of beliefs, right? So it's like, if you just hear something like that and it doesn't really fit in with the rest of what you believe, it's kind of like, well, okay, I can see how that works, but no. Which I imagine is probably like, if you hear like, yeah, Yahweh in the Old Testament, that's mostly Jesus. It's like, okay, interesting, but no. that's not really how it is. So just gotta move along. But if so a lot of times that sort of thing, it's like, well, that's going to have an impact on me. Like, I probably want to see someone say like, okay, well, here's 5 other times in the New Testament where this word or phrase is used, and here's the context. So now we go back. You know what I mean? Like, you get the whole fleshing out of the whole detail, and it's like, oh, okay, like I see more, how this would all fit together. So anyway, it's just a suggestion. Like, it might be interesting to take a couple of things and be like, hey, here's something I want you to read.
Sure. So one thing that we did kind of talk about is maybe going through a passage together.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And then we could maybe do that now. Speaking of, I mean, we could like, honestly, my world's been kind of rocked on John 1 recently. Like I said, there's been a lot of kind of back and forth and new content from some biblical Unitarians pushing John 1 as a new creation passage, which I always found virtually incredible.
Yeah.
That had me a little bit more open-minded to the topic than I was before. But I think that it might be interesting and helpful to go through John 1 and kind of hear what it sounds like from your perspective, and for me to sort of interact with that.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
also, you knowing Greek, that's super handy.
Yeah. It's funny. I've got like trying to go. I mentioned I'm trying to go through the Bible in a year. It's a lot more work than I thought it was. I remember reading it I guess when I was like a kid and I read through the Bible, I mean, I'm pretty sure I got through the Bible cover to cover in a year or less.
Yeah.
And I guess it's because I wasn't stopping and
Yeah.
like I just kind of read through and just like, oh, this is interesting stuff. But now it's like I've got 3 different New Testaments and like commentaries, and check the Greek and and when going through the Old Testament's even worse because now I have to read the Hebrew and the Septuagint and compare them. And I got a copy of the Samaritan version I'm translated. I'm like, this is taking a long time, man. But anyway, I got this. I got a couple of Orthodox. So the Orthodox Study Bible. There's this thing called the Eastern/Greek Orthodox New Testament, which is actually really good and has some interesting notes. And I just got this from the Holy Apostles Convent or whatever, the Gospels and so forth. So we can go through all of them. I don't know. I'll kind of look back and forth between them. Do you want to just go through John chapter 1 or?
Sure.
Okay.
In the beginning is a very good place to start.
Beginning. It's interesting you say this too. If we and since I brought up the idea of doing reading stuff, one of my big favorite things. I mentioned Daniel Boyarin earlier. He has an article called "The Gospel of the Memra," and it's about John chapter 1. Basically, his argument is that the word logos didn't come from Greek philosophy. It's just the Greek translation of memra from the Aramaic targums. And he basically takes the first chapter, or no, he takes the prologue to the Gospel of John to be a midrash on Genesis chapter 1 that's using Proverbs chapter 8 as the kind of secondary text or whatever. And he thinks logos is just the memra/wisdom or whatever. So anyway, all right, let's go through this. Should I just read? So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So this, interestingly, I'll tell you what this translation says, the EOB. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was what God was.
Mm-hmm.
Is how and he's got a note here. This will be interesting for you. So the Greek word logos is traditionally translated as word. French translations sometimes use verb, which has a dynamic quality. The English message or expression of the mind may also be appropriate attempts to convey the nuance of the Greek concept. The Jewish Alexandrian theologian and philosopher Philo wrote extensively about the logos in ways that are reminiscent of New Testament theology. For example, his teaching that for the logos of the living God, being the bond of everything, as has been said before, holds all things together and binds all the parts and prevents them from being loosened or separated, echoes Colossians 1:17. And then he has, in explaining this thing, the Word was what God was. In archi, logos, ke logos in proston theon, ke theos in logos. This second theos could also be translated divine, as the construction indicates a qualitative sense for theos. And he's got that like underlined. Yeah. The Word is not God in the sense that he is the same person, underlined, as the theos mentioned in 1:1a. He is not God the Father, parentheses, God absolutely, as in common New Testament usage, or the Trinity. The point being made is that the Logos is of the same uncreated nature or essence as God the Father, with whom he eternally exists. This verse is echoed in the Nicene Creed, quote, God, qualitative or derivative, from God, personal, the Father, light from light, true God from true God, homoousios with the Father. And I agree with that. So,
Interesting. Yeah. That was one of those things that that biblical Unitarians would always point out, and that whenever I would talk with my Trinitarian friends, it's like, well, no, it's not saying that it's the person or the being God. It's saying that it's divine or godness or godhood. So that's interesting. I think, sometimes I go back and forth. Is it saying like the word is just like part of the being God, or is it saying that it's divine? But I think that second one, that it's qualitatively describing it, is good. So verse 2 says, he was in the beginning with God. And is it true that it's using a personal pronoun like he there?
Oh, good question. So now I got to get the Greek out. I do have a nice app on my phone that gives, in the New Testament it doesn't matter, but in the Old Testament I can get like a column that has an English translation, and then a column with the Septuagint, and a column with the Hebrew, so it's nice. But so you're talking about this was in the beginning with God, or he was in the beginning with God, is utos. So it's kind of like, it's a masculine like this one, which is referring to the Logos. So this thing, this guy, was in the beginning with ton theon, the God.
So, and again, it's one of those things where in English it sounds a little bit more personal than it perhaps needs to.
For what? For the Logos, or
for the Logos? Yeah.
No, I think that's right. In Greek, it's saying like this thing, what we've just been talking about, meaning the Logos.
Because
so the Logos was with this being called God. So that, the funny thing about that is, it's pretty, it's not pretty clearly, it's totally clearly like distinguishing God and the Logos. These are two different things, but the Logos is in whatever sense qualitatively divine.
Right. And this is honestly where I might not have as many problems with kind of complexity of the Godhead two powers stuff, is that the way that I've always understood John 1, although like I said, some biblical Unitarians are starting to go in a different direction, is that the Logos is it's impersonal before the incarnation. It's like like an abstract mental concept, or it's like God's wisdom, God's plan. And just the same way that like a blueprint becomes a house, or a plan gets put into action, that's what the word becoming flesh means. Or it's like a prophecy being fulfilled, not a divine pre-existent person changing into a human existent person.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said, I think you mentioned something like that in your talk with Luke, and I thought you would really like 2/3 of Saint Maximus the Confessor, but not 1/3. So he has this thing, he talks about the 3 thickenings of the Logos. So the Logos is like a plan in God's mind, right? It's the forms kind of, but the first thickening is the creation, which the creation is all patterned on the logi that are inside the Logos. And then I think the second thickening, actually, I forget, the second thickening was the Torah and the Old Testament,
God's
scripture.
word. Yeah.
I could be wrong about that, or maybe anyway, whatever. And like the third thickening is the incarnation. So then it like finally all congeals together in this, individual human or whatever.
I don't dislike that idea.
No, okay.
I don't dislike that idea as long as we keep the logos impersonal before Jesus is
Oh,
born.
before, yeah.
It doesn't bother me that much. That is an interesting idea. Like, because there's a certain sense in which all of creation is sort of from God's mind and wisdom that way. And then there's
Oh, yeah.
and then there's scripture, which is something even extra. And then Jesus, which is something even extra on top of that. There's some version of that idea that I kind of like.
Yeah, maybe there are 3 thickenings of the logos. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot going on in, I mean, I'm sure this is in Maximus too, and others, where Jesus being the new Adam, you got to think about the first Adam being, in some sense, their so Adam as an individual is not there eternally or something, but there's kind of like the form of the man. And Adam was the first sort of attempt at instantiating that form or something, but that didn't pan out, so we've got a second go around or something that's Christ, and he is the man or something.
Right.
But yeah, I'm sure we can find something for you to disagree with at some point.
Yeah.
Yes, but anyway, yeah, no, but yeah, you want to say that the logos is impersonal. I'd have to, I guess, I don't know. I'm not sure quite what to say about that. Because on the one hand, I mean, I kind of lean towards being a classical theist and not wanting to say that God is really exactly a person anyway. But then, yeah, I do take the logos to be the appearance of the Old Testament theophanies, right? So I mean that's
personal. You can't wrestle with an abstract concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, well, I guess you can, but it's a very different sort of wrestling.
That is true. You can, and I mean, I think some people interpret it kind of that way, like that's what, like Jacob was wrestling with God. He's like thinking through the question.
Yeah. So, and this is one of those times where I feel like, there's a little bit of difference maybe, but sometimes we get really close where it's like, okay, yeah, I think there's one God who is above everything, and that there's this logos abstract concept that's with him, kind of from the beginning, and that all things were made through him, and that Jesus is that turned into a human being. I wouldn't say I turned into is almost even too strong of a word. Jesus is that manifest in a human being. And when we look into Jesus, we see God in a certain sense, right? That's right there in the New Testament. Jesus says that about himself. And Jesus is the image of the invisible God and the exact representation of his being and all that. It's like there's a couple things where if we just had a translation of terms, we're super close.
The funny thing, it's funny you said, because I mean, yeah, you've clearly got kind of more going on in your theology than I guess I assume a lot of. Oh, my cat trying to bite my cord here. So I mean, you're probably at this point, you're probably the biblical Unitarian I know the best. I know Dale sort of, and I've read his stuff, but I wonder, I wonder how common these sorts of views are, and if it would be, I wonder if things would seem less problematic to Trinitarians if they kind of got into that.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one way maybe to put it, because I've noticed this too, that sometimes, in some arguments, like in some debates, Unitarians will kind of try to push the Trinitarian into like Nestorianism and be like, well, you can only make this thing work if you go Nestorian. And I always kind of think like, well, but Nestorians are Trinitarians. They're just, they just have a different Christology. But I wonder if I wonder if there's not a way that biblical Unitarians could sort of be okay with Nestorian Christology, with some,
How
some
so?
kind of
Go more.
well, how so?
Yeah, go into that.
I mean, so if you buy into like a pre-existent logos, and that's something distinct from God the Father, and I mean, you probably want to say it's like subordinate in some kind of way or whatever, but
it's his wisdom, or something like that.
yeah, but I mean, so you might say like, hey, I believe that God eternally has this logos, and then I think there's this created human Jesus, right? That and they're hooked up in some kind of special relationship or something.
Right. Like for me, yeah, and this is something like for me, there's like the eternal Christ concept, right?
Yeah.
Like all of creation was waiting for Jesus to happen. Like Jesus is the climax of the whole show, right?
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which the idea of Jesus is like what God has in mind when he creates, and sort of the why for the whole thing. And so there's some kind of eternality to Christ in that sense. It's not as a conscious person running around,
Sure.
but it's like this. And I will admit that I'm also sounding kind of Platonic when I talk this way. And then there's like the lived out actual Jesus, right? And there's a relationship between what all of creation has been waiting for, and then this person who embodies that in a human life. And so there is sort of this dualistic way in which I think about Jesus, I guess, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, so what would you say about the relation between the logos and Jesus?
Sure. It's not like the logos is one thing that is running around in one place on earth, and like while Jesus was here on earth, the logos wasn't in heaven for 30 years or something like that. Like that seems like a little bit silly to me. It's sort of like wisdom is the, like in Proverbs 8, right? Wisdom is this thing where if kings have it, then their kingdoms flourish, and wise men do all the amazing things that they do when they embody wisdom and stuff like that. It's like this thing that's like potential in creation, but if you embody it and live it out, it's a good and right and righteous thing. And so Jesus is like that perfectly well done. And it's like I need an example, right? Wisdom is something that exists eternally in potential, but I need to see it, right? Like, you might in math class, your teacher might teach you about some equation, but it's like, okay, but could you give me an example of that on the chalkboard so that I know how to do my homework? And then seeing a worked out example helps you learn something in a way that just being taught the theory didn't do. And so it's sort of like I could be explained everything about what wisdom is, but it's another thing to see a perfect example of it lived out. Yeah. And that's sort of how I think of the relationship between Jesus and the Logos.
Yeah. Yeah, so it might be, I see where you're getting at with the Logos then being kind of impersonal, and then that might be something that Trinitarians wouldn't be able to.
Right. Or at least most, yeah.
Yeah.
Although sometimes I wonder if the church fathers would have been, or at least some of them would have been more okay with that. Like,
well, one thing to keep in mind too, I think one thing that gets, so it got dropped in a way during the Arian controversy, or I mean, sort of almost like forgotten about, and people don't keep it in mind today, is the distinction that's like regularly made in the pre-Nicene fathers between the sort of interior logos and the spoken logos. I forget how the Greek is, like in the athetos logos and logos prophorikos or whatever that is. But that was a kind of Stoic distinction between, like, you have a mental word and then a spoken word.
Sure.
that's one of the reasons. I think that's one of the sources of the, the pre-Nicene fathers all seem sort of inconsistent about, like, if you go back to them and try to figure out, like, are these guys Arian or are they Orthodox? It's like they're both and neither at the same time. Like, they don't really know that. And one way that people read that is kind of like, well, this wasn't a distinction that they were thinking about, so they just weren't really clear on it themselves. But also, I think people, I think sometimes there's confusion about, like, well, are they talking about the logos that's internal to God, quote unquote, like his mental whatever concept or plan or whatever, and then the spoken word, which is whatever he somehow externalizes when he wants to create.
Yeah.
Because they typically will say, like, that God always had this logos within him, and then when he wanted to create, he spoke the logos and begot it. Sometimes they'll use the language of, like, then he begot it. So then it looks like, well, then you've got a creature or whatever. But anyway, I don't know. I just was thinking that, you might make the case that, yeah, I mean, maybe you could make the case that, like, the internal logos is just it's God's wisdom, it's his plan, whatever. And I mean, my view on that, of course, is going to be like, I think the spoken logos is basically like the logos within creation. So, like, there is God or Yahweh who, like, occupies a particular position in space and can be seen and heard, and that's sort of God's representation within the creation, which that I think would not be congenial for you, but you might do something like, but in other words, you might make some kind of distinction where you could have the logos or an aspect of a logos that wasn't personal or something like that. I don't know. I'm brainstorming, but it's just interesting to me that the reason I thought this was interesting was because I think a lot of times when I hear biblical Unitarians talk, or I guess when I read them type, mostly, it just sort of sounds like the emphasis is so much on, like, Jesus is just a dude, like, don't try to have, and there's only God and what. So it's interesting to me to hear, like, well, yeah, there's this kind of plan, there's this logos thing, and it could be eternal, and I mean, that's sort of part of the Trinitarian picture. I mean, like, you're not going to go whole hog with it, but it's interesting to hear that that's maybe part of the view and is still acceptable,
Right. What turns me off, what, like, really starts to rub me the wrong way, I guess, is when Trinitarians talk about Jesus, like, voluntarily incarnating himself or something like that, or where Jesus is God come down to us to save us or something like that. That's something that like, more than some of the abstract stuff, really just, I'm like, oh, that just doesn't feel right. Like, I really don't like the idea of Jesus having been a divine heavenly person who could make decisions, like self-incarnating, and then somehow is now the human being, when previously he was a divine being. Whereas, an abstract plan or prophecy or for a predestined event now coming into being and starting, right? That's the kind of the story that makes more sense to me and seems more biblical.
Yeah, I got you. Do we want to go on with
sure
verse? So where are we here?
Well, verse 3, this one is very important too, so
okay. So all things came into being through him, and without him nothing came into being that has come into being. And he says, compare to Wisdom chapter 9 verse 1, which is one of these things as a former Protestant.
Yeah, it's like, uh-oh.
Yeah, I'm like,
what am I supposed to do with wisdom?
Yeah, like where does that even go in the Bible? Oh, and I wonder. So okay, I just pulled up Wisdom of Sirach, but I think this is Wisdom of Solomon that he's talking about. Well, I'm looking forward going through the Bible in a year, like to going through that, because that's you know, I mean, I never read the Apocrypha when I was a kid.
Yeah,
And
I still never have.
Yeah, but I've never read the whole deal. So Wisdom of Solomon 9, chapter 1 says, O God of our fathers and the Lord of mercy, who made all things by your word, which is logos, I assume in Greek. So made all things through your logos.
Yeah.
I guess I could.
And that's why I'm still pretty uncomfortable with the biblical Unitarians who are trying to turn this into a new creation passage. I'm still open-minded to hearing the best case put forward. But to me, this seems like it's very much connecting with Proverbs 8 and Genesis 1 simultaneously, right? Like, how does God create? He speaks. And Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8 was like, you know, I was there with God in the beginning. I helped him do all the things, etc. And to me, that just seems like a very straightforward connection to that idea.
Yeah, so I'm sure I don't, know about all the details of that interpretation that you would know, but I've seen that floated around. Yeah, and it seems implausible to me that this is about the new creation or anything else. And so my thing, if I were going to be a biblical Unitarian, I feel like that would not be the way I would want to go. I think the way that I would want to go with it would be probably something more like what excuse me, what you were talking about. Let's just make the logos not personal.
Right.
And not be Jesus and stuff. It seems like that would be. I mean, because look at Wisdom 9:1. God of our fathers and Lord of mercy, who made all things by your logos, and in your wisdom built a man. By you, he might be the master of what's created. Blah blah blah. Like, there's nothing in that verse that's obviously got to be personal, right? You made it through your wisdom. Like, why can't this just be a quality of God's or something?
Right. And it's like his power of speaking. It's like kind of simultaneously like his wisdom and his power of speaking. It's like both of that together. Yeah.
I mean, presumably the problem comes when we get to the incarnation stuff, but I assume you have a view where that's, well, maybe we'll get to that, and you can talk about what does it mean was to say the logos became flesh. But so in him was life, life that was the light of mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I'm just looking to see if they had any. Yeah, so he just points out this overcome can be translated as comprehended.
Yeah, and I think John does that sometimes where he uses a double meaning word, and he really does mean both meaning. It's sort of a word play. And I do think overcome and comprehend are sort of both intended. So like in the beginning of verse 4 where it says in him was life, is that what's that pronoun, right? Does it, because in English it sounds like we're talking about a person. But in Greek, I suspect that it's more ambiguous on whether it could be a person.
Well, I mean, so that's just a feature of the grammar,
right?
So I mean, logos is a so again, it's like this thing with Trinity is a she. Like, logos is a masculine noun,
right?
So in Greek, literally speaking, it says him, but that doesn't mean much for what it should be in English. So in English, the question is like, I mean, we have to, I would say we have to make an interpretation here.
Right.
Is the the Logos supposed to be a person? Well, if so, then let's translate that as him. But if the Logos is an it, then we should translate it as an it. And that's not
And
something
both are allowable, you know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't get that out of the grammar. What we mean by the difference between him and it is, I mean, yeah, when we use a pronoun with a masculine or feminine gender, we're kind of attributing like subjectivity to the thing. But in Greek, that's just not the case, right?
In Greek, you have to give it a gendered pronoun.
Yeah, in Greek, like if I was talking about the sun, like the sun in the sky, like helios, I'd say him, you know, that's just the grammar, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think that's I don't think that there's anything you can dig out of the language there.
Right. And like in terms of the content of what it's saying, in him was life and the life was the light of men. I think that's just sort of, you know, poetic stuff about how cool and important the Logos and wisdom is. You know, it's like the source of life because it's the source of creation, and like wisdom is the light that men see and stuff like that.
I suspect there's more to it than that. So I'd say, I mean, I think you can translate this like in it was light, was life, life was the light of mankind. But I think that motif of light and life is something that's already going on in some other, I don't know what they were, Jewish,
right? And Jesus will say
philosophical stuff. Yeah,
Jesus will say, "I am the life," right? Later on in this same book.
Yeah.
And then the light will also seemingly also get called, Jesus also gets called the light pretty directly at some point.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's like, I don't think it's like there's no connection between Jesus and the Logos here, right? Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't do this sort of one-to-one thing, I guess. I would keep something of a gap.
You wouldn't want to say like Logos is just another, it's like Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens, just another label we can stick on the same thing.
Right. I don't think it's a co-referring term with the pre-incarnate Son.
Pre-incarnate Christ, yeah. Right. So let's say there came a man sent from God whose name was John. John came as a witness to bear witness to the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he was sent to bear witness to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. That's an interesting way to put it.
That I will say does sound more strongly incarnational than it does sound like my way of putting it. It pushes me a little bit, but I don't think it's out of bounds. But one thing I will say is, like, why are we going straight from like the creation of the world to talking about John the Baptist? You know, it seems like kind of a weird, abrupt shift in focus.
I think that Boyarin maybe talks about that, because isn't it the first? What's considered the prologue? Just 1 through 11,
I guess. 1 through 18,
or 1 through 18.
Yeah.
Let's see. 18 would take us, or not to. Oh yeah. Well, so the John thing is in there starting in verse 6. Yeah, it is. That is interesting. I guess I can see how some people might want to take that to like make the beginning not the beginning of the world, because we're all of a sudden fast forwarding all the way to
John the Baptist. Yeah. That's probably one of their strongest points.
Yeah.
Is that why do we suddenly go from Genesis 1 to John the Baptist in one sentence? But I don't know. You know, you gotta jump into history at some point, and all the other Gospels do that with John the Baptist too. So that's not that unusual.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of how the Gospel of Mark starts. It's just like, hey, everybody, let's talk about John the Baptist. Jesus getting baptized. Like, who's Jesus? Where did this guy come from? Like, he's getting baptized. Let's talk about this.
Yeah, and even the other Gospels will talk about the conception of John the Baptist, right? So it's not that unusual, I guess, to just jump to John the Baptist.
Yeah, John the Baptist is a whole other interesting
Yes.
phenomenon, but maybe we'll get.
Sure. Yeah. I think one thing, Keegan Chandler, another one of the biblical Unitarian people, has helped me understand this, that the Gospel of John seems very anti-John the Baptist, or at least wants to make sure you're extra aware that you don't think John the Baptist is the Messiah, as if there were perhaps a competitive sect that he was having to worry about that still believed John the Baptist.
There are still Mandaeans around say that they're the disciples of John the Baptist and and they're like a weird Gnostic.
Yeah, in like southern Iraq or something
Jesus,
like that.
I mean, like Jesus was this lying piece of crap. Yeah, interesting stuff. I'm just kind of scanning back here. Oh my gosh, the end notes for this Holy Apostles Convent book of the Gospels. It's like pages of just like on the first verse. So we're not going to go through, I think, all of that. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not gonna try to tackle all that. All right, so he was in the. It was interesting though the way that guy translates it. He translates it as the true light which enlightens everyone was coming into the world, but it's normally translated he was the true light who enlightens everyone who comes into the world. Like the people, in other words, it's usually right. Like, let me see. This is probably.
I'm looking at the ESV right now, and it says the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world.
Oh, it says the true light was coming into the world.
Yeah.
Let me see what this should just be the King James at this point. The light shines, the darkness yeah, so the King James says, he was not that light, John the Baptist, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light which gives light to every man coming into the world. So there, the way they've translated it, it's the men who are coming into the world, and the Logos is giving light, rather than the Logos coming into the world.
That's weird.
So I imagine there's a kind of grammatical ambiguity here. So he came to bear witness concerning the light. Oh, that's weird. It just says, literally, it just says, was the light true, which lightens all the men. Every man coming into the world. I would tend to want to translate that the way the King James does. So the true light which lightens every man coming into the world.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a little ambiguous, but I mean, anthropon and erchomenon are just right next to each other. I would, if I hadn't thought about there being any ambiguity, I would probably translate it the other way. So
interesting.
Yeah, that is.
That does seem to be a little different. So then, verse 10 is normally where a biblical Unitarian might say it starts talking about Jesus.
Right. So he was in the world, and the world had come into existence through him, and the world did not recognize him.
Right. And this is where it does seem to be talking about the Logos and Jesus more one-to-one synonymously than I might prefer to be comfortable with. but it is perhaps not completely unacceptable to the way that I was trying to explain it.
Here's a thought for you. So, I mean, again, it says he was in the world, but I mean, there's not really like a he there.
Right. Yeah.
In fact, I don't think this, I mean, it just says into cosmo in, so it's just like in the world was.
Right.
And third person was, so it's like he, she, it, whatever we've just been talking about was in the world.
So interesting. So it
in the world through him, but there again, him can be it, right? So so you might think of that even as just like, hey, the logos is in the world, like it somehow permeates the world, and the world was created through it, and it's in the world, but the world doesn't recognize it.
Right, because people aren't living wisely or something.
Yeah.
And then
not know him, but the him could be an it.
Mm-hmm. How about verse 11 where it says he came to his own and his own people did not receive,
and those who were his own did not receive him. So just into, so literally it's like to the own, like the own ones. He, she, it came. And the owns of him or of it did not receive him, did not receive.
Yeah. And so is that like the Jewish people heard the words of God, but they rejected it? Or is it Jesus came to his own people and his own people did not recognize him as the Messiah? It seems that I generally think that's what the own people is that we're talking about the Jews, whether or not they're receiving the word.
Given how fond John is of the Jews.
Right. Yes.
He came to his own people, and those nasty people, didn't accept him.
Yeah, and so verse 12, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God.
Yeah. But as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name. Yeah, so I mean, again, it could be as many as received him or it, he, she, or it gave to them the authority or the power to become children of God, to the ones believing in the name of him or it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so
go ahead.
So either we're talking about Jesus now, which seems most likely, or we could still be talking about sort of God's word as either wisdom or prophecy in scripture, or like the word of the prophets or something.
Yeah. I was about to say, I mean, the grammar is still kind of ambiguous, but I do think, when we get into talking about receiving his name, just because that elsewhere in the New Testament, it's kind of obvious, like the name of Jesus is
right. So if I'm going to be making some sort of finer distinction between logos and Jesus, I need to start switching the pronouns somewhere in that paragraph.
Somewhere earlier.
And it doesn't seem obvious where that would be. It would be one thing if it was like just super clear that after verse 14, when the word becomes flesh, that we can just start talking about Jesus. But verses 12 and 13 certainly seem to be about Jesus.
That's funny. When we first started out here and you were talking about the logos being impersonal, whatever, I was thinking ahead to verse 14 and I was like, well, that's going to be the place where we'll have to talk about like, what does that mean? But yeah, maybe the word became flesh can just mean took on, hooked up to human or was perfectly exemplified in a concrete way or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is interesting here. I think here the difficulty is John came as a witness to bear witness to the light. And then after that point, we just get a bunch of pronouns that have to refer back to the light, right? So it's the light, so that all might believe through him, which would be John. He was not the light, but was sent to bear witness to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone coming into the world, it was in the world. So it's the light that was in the world, and the world had come into existence through the light, and the world did not recognize it, the light. It came to its own people, the light, and those who were its own or his own did not receive it. But then as many as did receive the light gave them the ability to become God's children, to those who believed in the name of the light. And yeah, if believing in the name is going to be Jesus, then it looks like Jesus is
right.
If his name is the name of Jesus, then the Jesus has got to be the light.
Right. And that really is the difficulty with this interpretation, is that it seems to blur from logos to life to light to Jesus over the course of that chunk there, and doesn't seem very persnickety about clarifying.
The one thing I can think of, I mean, this is kind of maybe this is a stretch, but strictly speaking, right, it says that there was, so there's the logos, and the logos came into, or the things came into existence through the logos. So strictly speaking, what it says is, in the logos was life, and the life was the light of mankind, and the light shines in the darkness. So you might, I mean, if you want to get, maybe it's Gnostic or but I mean, you could say, well, there's this thing called the logos, and then there's something that's being referred to as the light. Maybe that's distinct from the logos, and then it's the light that comes into the world or something.
Although there is something weird where we, no matter who's interpreting it, there's some weird chronology, right? Where 14 seems to be, almost everyone agrees that it's about Jesus being born, the word becoming flesh. But yet we already are talking before that verse about it coming to its own people and its own people not receiving it, but everyone who does receive it, right? So that seems to be referring to events in Jesus's lifetime. But then in verse 14, we kind of reflect back to the birth. So that could be another way that it's like, somewhere in there, the logos changes into the person Jesus, and then verse 14, we just kind of back up and re-clarify that again.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It looks kind of like, well, I mean, really, you've got almost three tellings of the same sort. So you got, in the beginning was the Word, and so forth, and things came into being through him. I mean, you've got the light shines in the darkness, dark having overcome it. So you've got, there came a man sent from God, whose name was John. Right. So starting in verse 6 there, and then John came as a witness. He wasn't the light, but he was sent to bear witness to the light. Blah blah. And then maybe a second, like, he was in the world, and the world came into existence through him, and the world didn't recognize him. And then you've got the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us.
And
yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of lay those out. Two or three.
Some people, an interpretation that I don't particularly like is that the Word becoming flesh is the baptism. You can at least see that it's not the most ludicrous thing, because it fits a little bit with the chronology, but in general, I don't like that idea, because that also seems sort of Gnostic-y, where there's this spirit or something that suddenly indwells Jesus, that changes him into something he wasn't, and sort of
was he not flesh before the baptism?
Right, or
Or I guess, I mean, I don't know, maybe I don't know if this is the idea, but if the idea was something like Jesus was just kind of maybe sinless, but whatever, before and at the baptism, I mean, if you had a kind of view where the Logos hooks up with Jesus at the baptism, like a sort of adoptionist sort of thing, then maybe in that's the sense in which the Logos became flesh or something.
Right.
Is that at the baptism there was this big?
Because one does have to ask, why are we talking about John the Baptist before we get to the Word becoming flesh? But I like your idea of it sort of repeating itself a couple times, because that's also a kind of Jewish thing to do.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that is repeating it in different words is kind of a Jewish thing. Let's see, where are we? Well, we kind of mentioned he came to his own; those who were his own did not receive him. As many as received him, to them he gave the ability to become God's children, to those who believe in his name. They were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
That seems like that sort of born again idea from John 3.
Oh, interesting. It says a few manuscripts and ancient writers read he instead of they in reference to the incarnate Logos. So those would have said he was born not of blood, I guess, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that could be a virgin birth reference.
Or super Gnostic, which might explain why the Gnostics like that, right? I mean, they like that. He wasn't born of blood, nor the will of flesh, nor the will of man.
Because it is weird that John never mentions the virgin birth.
It doesn't mention anything. Doesn't even mention the baptism.
Right. Yeah. Unless the Word becoming flesh is the baptism.
Yeah, unless that is the baptism.
But I think it avoids mentioning the baptism because it doesn't want to.
I do think this has to be. You say what? Sorry.
I think that it avoids mentioning the baptism so it doesn't give fuel to the John the Baptist sect to claim superiority over Jesus.
Yeah. I think John doesn't want to talk about the baptism.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I do think that this looks to me like kind of two tellings of the same story, whatever. Because if you tried to make this one thing where it's going in chronological order, you've got already in verse 12, as many as received him, to them he gave the ability to become God's children. Well, that seems like something that's going to come like in the middle of his ministry or afterwards or whatever, like the people that believe in him. So then you would be kind of rewinding anyway, like back to the baptism, which would be before people believed in him.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would have a good version of how this was strictly chronological. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, right? And that dwelt is the tabernacle word, which is interesting.
Right. Pitched his tent. A strong allusion to the journey motif discussed in the introduction. He must mean like his introduction to the book of John. Anyway.
And we have seen his glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And another thing that the Gospel of John is sort of uniquely careful about is making sure that Jesus sounds really unique, right? We don't want any other sons of God out there running around.
It's funny. This translates it as we beheld his glory as a Father's uniquely begotten Son, full of grace and truth.
Right, and it's monogene. What's that? What's the word for being? Yeah. So that's interesting.
I guess this guy has a whole appendix on monogenes, unique because of his origin and so forth. Oh, interesting. Oh, it's Appendix C, John 1:1 and 18, Jesus as, quote, God. He goes into, he's got a whole appendix in here about that issue in 1:1, and then in 1:18, It's really before 118, but anyway, it says John 1:18 presents a double difficulty. The first aspect is the original Greek is debated. Several ancient manuscripts read monogenes theos, only begotten or unique God, instead of monogenes huios, only begotten or unique Son.
This is perhaps the most debated manuscript verse in the whole New Testament.
Yeah.
It seems like I would suspect that my version of the telling would be that there's the original, which is no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son, who is at the Father's side or in the Father's bosom. He has made him known. But then some say no one has ever seen God, the only begotten Son, who is God, is at the Father's side. And then some say no one has ever seen God, the only begotten God. And the Arians used to really like the only begotten God manuscripts because they thought that that fit their theology better. And the Nicaeans liked the only begotten Son, who is himself God. And and then us biblical Unitarians are like, but maybe it was just the only begotten Son who's at the Father's side.
Yeah.
And everyone can pick their own adventure on that one.
Yeah, I have read up on that a little bit. It's a mess.
It is a mess.
Let's see.
But there is that idea again that we kind of already talked about. We're skipping a couple verses, but that this unseenness to God, right? And then Jesus is the seen one through which you can see God or make that God's getting made known.
Right. Do you want to just finish this thing out and then we'll talk about 118?
Yeah.
So we beheld his glory. Actually, we'll talk about glory in a second. So glory as the Father's uniquely begotten Son, full of grace and truth. So John testified about him. He cried out, saying, "This was the one of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me." At that actually, so that I think might be an interesting thing to think about. When he was before me. So he cried out, saying, "This was about whom I said, the one coming after me." So let's see. Opis then. So from the backside after me. So the one coming after me was before me. So literally that's from ginomai. So that's really came to be. I mean, so to me that looks like literally the one coming after me came into being before me because he was over me, or like protos, like
and
for me. That's a really
protos I've heard can mean before in time or above in rank.
More important, right?
Yeah. So
the weird thing is, I mean,
did I lose you? Beau, did I lose you?
But I mean that it looks like it just came to be.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, Orthodox Trinitarians don't want to say he came to be before John, but well, I guess Arians would be good with that.
Yeah.
Because he came into being.
Arians always liked John 1.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I would say, like, what do I think John the Baptist is saying? He's like, so Jesus comes after me, but he's actually more important than me.
Well, here, so this translates it, and let's see how the King James. This is he of whom I said, "He who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me." And that's how this one translates it too. he said me because he was before me, but I don't know, unless it's a little bit hard to read on here, but I thought it looks like the opposite way around. The one coming after me. Oh, I'm sorry, Emprosthen. Okay, that's where they're getting is before me. No, it's the one coming after me. Oh, was or came to, I don't know, but anyway, was Emprosthen. Me, whatever, so whatever that means, because he was before me. But yeah, you might try to translate that as, I mean, protos, I don't know. I mean, maybe if it's just sort of more important.
I suspect, and this is something that doesn't play into my hand, but he might be making one of those double puns again.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Where he might actually mean something like both senses of the word.
Yeah.
Like Jesus outranks me and he antecedes me.
That's something I'm going to have to look into now. Is I wonder if that's. I'll have to look into that more and see what I think about whether that means he existed or if he came into existence, which would not be good for me. But so anyway, that's an interesting point. This thing about he who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me. And from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And then no one has seen God at any time. The uniquely begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has, quote unquote, explained him.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think that is the word for where we get hermeneutics from, right? Isn't it? No, it's not. It's for exegesis, exegesato.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, one of the things that's big for I mentioned the glory when we kind of passed by that we beheld his glory as the Father's uniquely begotten Son, which that's a big deal for Orthodox theology because the glory it's a big deal for us, the uncreated light, as Gregory Palamas and Hesychus call it. So for us, that's like the Shekinah, the glory. I mean, we hear about this in the Old Testament, God coming in glory, and saw the glory of the Lord and so forth. And Jesus, so I mean, the idea is for Orthodox theology would be like the glory of the Lord. It's one of the divine energies. So it's like one of the ways that you recognize the presence of God is the glory.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's this thing where but Jesus shows up and he has that same glory, like the same light or whatever. That's kind of how you recognize him. Which, I mean, sometimes I feel whenever I'm talking about I guess this is because I'm not a Protestant anymore. I kind of just got got myself to think you can ultimately make the Bible mean whatever you want. So whenever I get here's the, I start to be here's the Orthodox view or whatever. And then I get to the end of it and I think, but really someone's just going to be who gives a crap? Yeah, that's the Orthodox view, but I'm not So I always get to the end of something and I think, well, but probably, I don't know, why does anyone give a crap? So I never know when something's going to sound plausible or something. I guess it's kind of easier to make, in a way, it's easier to shoot down an interpretation and say there's some problem with it and why it's not plausible, rather than take any positive proposal and be oh, that's
right.
I mean, in a way.
And one thing that I like is trying to dig in and get the spiritual nuggets out of it. and like
Yeah.
not just be content, oh, well, he's just referring to the transfiguration. Okay, we can tie a bow on that one. We know how to explain it. Like the goal isn't to just be able to explain every verse, right? This is supposed to be a spiritually enriching experience to
And get something out of it deeper.
yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah,
agree.
right. And
Really,
so
that's one of the things that was influential in me. Like something that I got really dissatisfied with long ago was like I felt like that was what a lot of the exegesis that I came across was doing. Just like, well, we can check this box and we've got an explanation for why this isn't a proof text against us, but it is against the Roman Catholics or whatever it is.
right,
You know,
right,
it's like, and I was reading Jewish stuff and I was like, oh, but this is really like deeper and more interesting and whatever. But yeah, that's the idea. I mean, the transfiguration too. The idea is like that's the Shekinah, and why only some of the disciples were able to go up there too, right? The
right,
other ones weren't quite ready for that.
right. And
And
when
Moses could be there because Moses had saw the Shekinah, and so did Elijah. Elijah was in heaven anyway and seen it. So, but yeah.
yeah, and when your goal of interpretation is to just be able to explain something, almost like explain it away, it's like some weird defense mechanism where like your intellect is protecting like your heart from getting involved or something like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's
And
for sure. It's an avoidance like defense mechanism thing. But I do think, and I mean that's kind of natural. But I do think, yeah, it's yeah, prevents us from getting the point, like the deeper meaning of the scripture. Which this is one of the things that like it just seems clear to me in the Bible and like, explicitly when Jesus preaches, like he doesn't say like, hey, I've got all this really clear, well spelled out and explained doctrine. If you just follow the instructions, guys. I mean, he's always like, I mean, he's always saying like, he tells the disciples, I'm speaking in parables so that they won't understand.
right,
I mean, he just says it flat out. He's like, so that it will be fulfilled. Hearing you shall hear and not understand, and so because of the hardness of their hearts. I mean, he's always kind of like, look, if your heart is open to it, then you'll understand these parables and what they mean, and they have these deeper meanings and stuff. And like half the time, he doesn't explain the parables. Like half the time, it's like
right,
some of the times they'll say like, "Will you explain this to us?" I'm like, "Okay, here's what it means," But like half the time, it's just here's a parable.
right,
He who has ears to hear, let him hear. I hope you get it.
right,
I mean, it's almost as though to say like, there's something way deeper here. I hope you're open to it.
right,
Like, and yeah, and I do think that's one of the things I really appreciate about a lot of the exegesis of the church fathers is like people. A lot of modern day commentators will be like, well, there's a lot of these fanciful, interpretations and whatever. And it's like, but in some cases I'm like, I don't know. I mean, if you really believe in the Bible at all, like a lot of it's kind of like, this makes some sense, like there's a deeper, deeper point going on here. We just had the Sunday of the prodigal son not too long ago, and I forget who it was I was reading on this, but I've kind of thought this for a while, and I came across it in one of the church fathers, and he just said like, yeah, the one sheep that was lost is the human race, and the 99 other sheep are like various angelic beings and whatever, and like the coins, like the 2 coins and one was lost, it's like the angels, and then there's humans, like there's the one that fell, and so like it's like, oh, that's interesting, like we're the one sort of intellectual or spiritual race of beings that got lost and need to be found and taken back, whatever. And it's like, people will say, well, that's just, they're just pulling it out of the butts or whatever. But it's like, well, I mean, that could be right, I mean, that could be, anyway,
Right.
gets you to thinking more deeply about, about what is the theology going on there? Like, are there, I mean, like, anyway, there's a whole other thing about that with the sons, like us becoming, quote, sons of God. And there's sons of God in the Old Testament, and they're a class of angels of some sort, or just all the angels or whatever. Anyway, but yeah, so there's the glory, and we beheld his glory. The glory is the Father. And that's interesting too, because it says we beheld, so we saw his glory. And then later it says no one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who's in the bosom of the Father, has exegesotoed him. So it's kind of, which that's something that Schuyler I was talking to about that. It's I think Dale has addressed that like a couple of times, and it's never quite got a handle on sort of what the idea is. I mean, so one, I guess the most obvious way to try to tackle that is to say, like, there's some sense in which God can be seen, and then there's some sense in which God can't be seen. I'm a little bit resistant to that, I guess, just because it seems like it gets repeated a lot and in some pretty emphatic terms. Like, so Jesus later says, like, you have never at any time seen his form nor heard his voice.
Right.
And especially the heard his voice thing, because there's, like, in the Old Testament, if you just have the Deuteronomy thing where it's like, well, no one can see me and live, you can kind of think, well, okay, maybe there's a sense in which you can, a sense in which you can't. And there's a point in, I think, Numbers where Moses says, remember, you heard his voice, at Mount Sinai, you heard his voice, but you saw no form. So don't make an idol or anything, because you only heard the voice. But then Jesus comes along and it's like, not only have you never seen his form, you've never heard his voice either. So it's like, well, whose voice was that? And then later you get with Paul, like, he dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has seen nor could see.
Right.
It's not even possible. And you could still say, like, well, there's a sense in which no one could possibly see him. But then there's another sense in which you can. But what I guess I would kind of think when I hear that stuff is, like, I mean, so it seems pretty emphatic. And so, like, I really would like to hear from Dale or whoever, like, what exactly is the sense in which you can see God and the sense in which you can't.
That's interesting. I had always thought these verses that talk about you can't see God was a argument against the Trinity, right? I always thought that these verses were comforting for me. Like, no one can see God. Did people see Jesus? Ergo, Jesus isn't God.
Oh, so he's not God. Yeah, right.
Like, what better, argument do you need than that? But now I'm seeing something, what you're saying, like, I had always felt a little bit like, well, like, hey, Paul, hey, John, are you forgetting about Moses? It certainly seems like Moses saw God. And are you just saying, well, no one, well, oh yeah, I didn't mean Moses, obviously Moses, but maybe I mean everyone else. Although it never says that either. But I hadn't
really
ever. But then your argument of the Old Testament God that they saw is Jesus. And there's the pre-incarnate Son, and that the fullness of God, the Father, was still up in unapproachable light or something beyond that. I have never heard that before. Like you said earlier in the conversation, when you said that, the Old Testament God most of the time is Jesus, that surprised me. So I see your point. I'd never thought about that before.
the interesting thing, if you ever read, I mean, you read Justin Martyr, and he says this sort of stuff too. I mean,
I just wiped that off as Platonism. That was not true.
See, here, that's the thing. See, I think a lot of people say, like, well, must be from Platonism because Plato has a God that you can't really know or grasp and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But when the church fathers talk about it, they never say, like, Plato had a good idea here, guys. What they always say is they just say, like, hey, no one can see God. And that's like, if you read through the arguments, it's always like that's their starting premise, and then they go back and say, well, so this must have been the angel of the Lord and blah blah blah. But yeah, I went through here like not too long ago the kind of like from Justin Martyr up to like Clement of Alexandria, and literally every single one of these guys. So like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Theophilus, Athenagoras, like they all do this, and it's all the same motif. It's all, you can't see or hear God the Father, so all of this Old Testament stuff, like where God is visible or audible, has to be the Son of God. Like it's not God the Father.
And perhaps the reason why I never would have heard that argument from more egalitarian Trinitarians is because then they'd have to say that Jesus isn't God in a way that they wouldn't be comfortable with. But you're sort of in between on that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, that's when as soon as you said that, like about, well, you can see Jesus, so Jesus isn't God, I was thinking, like, so, but here it's the God, it's O Theos, right? So, I mean, I do think that works. I think that's actually an interesting, I had never thought about that, but that is, I think, an interesting argument to the egalitarian Trinitarian. It's just kind of like, yeah, Jesus is the God.
Like in verse in John 1:18, what more, how could it get more clear that there's a stark difference between them? If one's not seen and then one's here making him known.
Yeah. I had never thought about that, but I'm going to add that to my arsenal.
Well, now previously I thought it was in my arsenal, and now you're making me uncomfortable, and now I need some better explanation of what exactly Moses saw. Because that is there's like 4 or 5 verses in the New Testament that make that point pretty strongly, that God is not seeable. And I do know what you're saying, that the what I will say the Platonist logos early church fathers also repeat.
Yeah, there's a handful in the Gospel of John, and interestingly, it repeats the same thing in the first epistle of John, almost like word for word, which kind of makes you think like maybe this was written by the same guy.
I think.
Yeah, and then in Paul does the same thing. Yeah, Paul has the thing like he dwells in unapproachable light that no man has ever seen or could see. Like it's the word
super emphatic,
possibility. Yes, and that's the thing that makes me, I guess, like from a logical point of view, you can make it as emphatic as you want, and it's like, well, if there's an equivocation going on, then there's an equivocation going on.
Yeah.
But from a just like reading it and what's kind of the sense or the feel that I get from it, it's just, I feel like when they make it that emphatic, like no one has ever at any time seen God. He dwells in unapproachable light. No one could see him. Jesus says, like, you have at no time have you ever seen his form or heard his voice, and all this stuff. Like it just feels like that's not like in a certain sense you can see and hear God, but
except for Moses.
Yeah, that's another thing that's interesting. So there's a thing, there's the passage where Yahweh says to Moses, or says, actually he's speaking to Aaron and Miriam, and he says, with other prophets, basically, he says, I will appear to them in a vision or a dream, whatever. But to Moses, my servant, I speak face to face. And you could kind of say like, well, maybe people, you can't see God like physically or something. Like you just see a vision, you know, or something.
Yeah.
And so there's that sense you can see God, but you don't like literally see him.
Right.
But the funny thing
or
is
like when like Isaiah will give you a prophetic vision into the throne room of God, and even then it seems like it's the highest God, right? But it's a prophetic vision or something like that, not.
Yeah, well, you could make that distinction between like a vision is different from like seeing God, but then Yahweh says like, but Moses will see me face to face.
Right.
So like it looks like Moses has seen God like in whatever sense you want.
Materially? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, mouth to mouth, face to face.
Right. So that is interesting. This is like I had this is an argument that I've never encountered before. Because like I said, I always thought that these verses were more or less in my favor. Huh. So I'll definitely have to think about that.
Yeah, yeah, we'll talk more, I'm sure, about it. But it's interesting to me to hear, it's comforting in a way, I guess, to hear that you haven't heard of that argument. Because I kind of wonder sometimes, it's like, is this just not out there in the ether or whatever, you know, for people to.
Right. Well, I wish that to make me feel more comfortable with this argument, I would wish that there was a clearer passage in the New Testament that that more directly connected Jesus with the angel of the Lord or something like that. Like,
well, here's what I've thought about this. I mean, this is kind of it's kind of the same issue anyway. So sometimes, here's I guess what I'm thinking is like sometimes biblical Unitarians get into this thing where like they make all these arguments about, they try to undercut like the view that Jesus is the angel of the Lord, and I always think like it's in a way totally irrelevant whether Jesus, and the reason I say it is because it's like, I mean, suppose that you go through the Old Testament and you say, okay, let's say you just convince yourself that the Old Testament theophanies are not God the Father. Mm-hmm. And then you convince yourself that, okay, well, the person who spoke to Moses in the burning bush has to be the angel, because what else, what other option do we have? So I'm going to believe that all the Old Testament theophanies are the angel of the Lord. And he gets called God and Yahweh, and that's interesting. Something's going on there.
Or
I just don't identify him with Jesus. But I mean, so here's the issue. Like the real, Romanides makes this point at one point, a Greek Orthodox theologian said, you know, he was talking with some Jewish guys or whatever, and he was like, the deal with the Council of Nicaea, he was like, the question is just, is the angel of the Lord created or uncreated? And they were like, oh yeah, okay. Well, I mean, is that all you were talking about? Like, he's like, yeah, that's all. That's what it's all about. But if you get, I mean, you don't have to. Obviously, it's not like in the Old Testament the angel of the Lord is homoousios with God the Father. So it's. But the point is, like, whatever problems may or may not be created by the angel of the Lord, like that's just there. And then if you identify the angel of the Lord with Jesus or not, doesn't really add anything extra. You see what I'm saying? I mean, if the angel of the Lord, if you decide the angel of the Lord is uncreated and has the divine nature, that's already, I mean, whatever's a problem with Trinitarianism, I mean, that's a problem for that view. And it really, identifying the angel of the Lord with Jesus is just, I mean, okay. So that's and if you decide the angel of the Lord is a creature, and so, you know, I'm going to be kind of an Arian, then you identify the angel of the Lord with Jesus. I mean, it doesn't really affect anything whether the angel of the Lord is Jesus or not. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? I mean, at least from the point of view of just whether there's a Trinity or not. Like, am I going to be Trinitarian or Arian or what? I mean, I guess that it entails. I guess it entails Jesus pre-existing his birth. So I guess I can see why Unitarians need to argue against it. But it really doesn't do. I mean, it doesn't get you any further necessarily than Arianism.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I guess I guess it's relevant if you really want to keep the picture that Jesus didn't pre-exist his birth, but that's the only issue, is just pre-existing the birth.
Right. Yeah.
Here's another thing though that I think it's I guess maybe it's an issue because people don't realize, like, this is the view in Eastern Orthodoxy, sort of, that that the Old Testament theophanies are not God the Father. So maybe they don't think it's relevant. Sorry, I just totally brain farted. I was about to say something super profound.
I'm sure it was.
It was great. It was going to be the most enlightening thing ever, and then I just totally lost what I was going to say. Anyway, I'll shut up and let you talk.
Yeah. Well, I should probably wrap it up soon.
That's true. Yeah.
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 So, but no, I appreciate this. You gave me plenty. You certainly gave me plenty to think about, and I'll have to go through and re-listen to this. It's always weird watching a video of yourself having a conversation, but it is helpful to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think that in future conversations for us, we could come prepared with an even more specific topic or passage or book passage or something like that.
I think it would be fun to do something like you suggest a paper or a chapter or something for me, and I do one for you, and we could split the time, like 50-50, talking about one, talking about the other, or something like that.
Sure. That could be good.
Yeah. Anyway, I enjoy talking through this stuff with you, and I actually got another thing in my arsenal for egalitarian. So I have some stuff to add too. But anyway, I enjoy talking with you, and I like what you're doing with just trying to have conversations, and rather than kind of super confrontational, debates and whatever. So anyway, I appreciate a lot what you're doing.
All right. Well, I appreciate you taking your time to talk with me. It's very generous of you.
No problem. All right, I'll let you go then.
Okay.
All right.
Good night.